In early 2020, while fans were celebrating the 20th anniversary of No Strings Attached, ET Canada published a piece suggesting that NSYNC's breakup could be traced back to Lance Bass. But after following all 5 members through the year that marked their final era, the historical receipts tell a different story. Let's get into it with the last episode of Season 1, Echoes versus Evidence. One band, 5 voices, and 5 trajectories over the course of 2001. That's what we've covered in this first season of Unsynchronized, and now it's time to compare what we know to what some people want us to believe. I'm Nicole Raposo, and you're listening to Unsynchronized, the deep dive podcast where we get into how NSYNC got out of sync, and eventually called it quits. So before we get into the article that sparked this entire project, I want to return to the theme that opened the season. When I said that the theme for this season was Bringin' the Noise, I wasn't just thinking about the song from No Strings Attached. I was thinking about what noise meant for NSYNC at the turn of the millennium. In 2000, the noise was record-breaking success and cultural saturation, and basically the kind of visibility that most artists never experience. We talked about that in the first episode. But in 2001, the noise changed. Outside of the group, the noise got louder, and it wasn't always celebratory. Some people in the media started wondering whether the momentum would hold, and others blew past wondering into counting the minutes until the next big thing took off. Inside the group, the noise changed because they pushed boundaries by taking their sound in different directions. It also changed because of some private conversations surrounding a break and what may or may not happen during that time off. That's why the theme still fits. Because the noise never went away, it just became something else. And decades later, there's still noise. Some of it was joyful, like the No Strings Attached 20th anniversary. And some of it was problematic, like the ET Canada article by Leena Tailor. On March 24th, 2020, ET Canada published an article called, "Did Lance Bass's astronaut and acting aspirations break up in sync?" This article was written by Leena Tailor. The piece opens with an unsupported premise, that most people blame Justin Timberlake's solo career for the group's breakup. Then the article positions itself as corrective, as if it's going to offer a more nuanced explanation based on input from musicians and executives, as Leena put it. But the factors that she brings forward in the article mostly redirect the blame towards Lance Bass. Lance is quoted in the article, but his commentary is sandwiched between input from several people who were in the group's orbit but not members of NSYNC, creating an imbalance of perspectives that tilts the narrative against him. When I first read the ET Canada article, I wasn't thinking about a multi-year research project. I just knew that something felt off. It didn't seem right, but I couldn't put my finger on why. And I had to be honest with myself about that. I didn't actually know how NSYNC broke up. I only knew that the public was fed some line about a hiatus and that the group never reunited for anything other than one-off events. At first, the article mattered to me simply because it didn't make sense. But the deeper I got into the research, the more I realized that it mattered for a much bigger reason. It's an example of how entertainment media can take advantage of the public's limited memory or their limited access to primary sources, and steer them towards a narrative that isn't supported by actual history. In a nutshell, this article is narrative management in a nostalgic slipcover. It's a prime example of how a media outlet can take a complex, emotionally charged moment in pop culture history and flatten it into a story that's convenient, easy to digest, and something that shifts responsibility away from the people who actually made the decisions. And because so many fans don't remember the details of the so-called hiatus, or at this point, there are fans who weren't even born yet, articles like this become a touchstone for people even though they don't line up with the history. So ultimately, this article matters because it shows how easily a simplified narrative can mask a truth that's much more complex. I think the easiest way to parse out the article is to look at the people involved, starting with the writer, Leena Tailor. Her writing and the way she set up the article set the tone for the piece, starting with the clickbait title. And yes, I'm calling it clickbait. because it follows a well-documented pattern in digital media. Negative headlines or conflict-framed headlines generally get more clicks than neutral or positive ones. So when you see a title like, "Did Lance Bass's astronaut and acting aspirations break up in sync?" it's not just a question. It's designed to pull you in by suggesting blame before the article even begins. Like I mentioned before, the introduction to the article includes an unsupported claim that most people blame Justin and his solo career for NSYNC never reuniting. The article also claims that there are several other factors to consider when it comes to NSYNC's breakup. When I look at this article as a whole, there are two big distortions from Leena that jump out at me. First, when talking about the idea that Lance may not have been acting in the group's best interest, she collapses about 6 years into one moment and makes it seem like a certain conversation happened in real time. In Lance's memoir, which she did mention was published in 2007, he recalled being told that none of them were operating in the best interests of the band by Justin. And the supposed proof of this was Lance and Joey making the film On the Line. The problem is that this section of the memoir was Lance looking back at a meeting that he recalls happening in 2004. And it was a comment about something that happened 3 years prior, since, as we've established this season, On the Line was made and released in 2001. But the way this article is structured, it's implied that the comment about not working in the best interest of the band was something directed to Lance in 2001, which isn't something that's implied in his book. The second distortion is that Leena reordered the timeline of events by making it seem like Lance's desire to do a space mission was the cause of the so-called hiatus. She does this by leaning on some quotes from one of the other people she interviewed for the piece, and it's a problem because the historical receipts don't point in that direction. Something else that stands out in the article is that Leena isolated Lance by giving him no supporting voices and by positioning his comments after comments from two men who both opposed him. Two men who both point to him, or at least to his side projects, as the reason why NSYNC started to fall apart. They both contradicted Lance's perspective, and so did the third person she interviewed. Even if it's not a manufactured consensus exactly, it still positions his input against three other people who disagree with him. On top of that, the article applied editorial skepticism only to Lance, the only person who was actually in NSYNC. Leena uses phrases like "as far as he recalls," which she never uses with the other men she interviewed. Meanwhile, the perspectives of the three people who were not in the group and had incomplete information are presented with more confidence and with less doubt. Then there's the vulnerability framing. Leena includes this long, pretty personal quote from Lance about taking on outside projects as a distraction from his sexuality. And that is part of his story. He's talked about that openly. But the placement of that comment feels off. It's a full paragraph about his emotional state, and in the article, it comes right before the part where he actually explains what he remembers from the timeline for the hiatus. That's the important part. That's the part that contradicts the article's premise. And instead of summarizing the emotional context for Lance in one sentence, the article focuses on it in a way that emphasizes his vulnerabilities instead of what he remembers. What's interesting is that none of the other men's vulnerabilities or blind spots are mentioned at all in this article. I'm sure they had their own pressures and limitations when it came to their work. Everybody does. But the article doesn't use any of that to contextualize their perspectives. It only uses Lance's vulnerability, and the article uses it in a way that kind of frames his recollection as less reliable. I think that imbalance matters because Lance was the only person in the article who actually lived through the internal dynamics of NSYNC. And by the time this article was published, his recollection had been consistent for over a decade at that point. Toward the end of the article, Leena uses fake neutrality to smooth over the biased comments and turn the conversation towards Burnout. She says, and I quote, Regardless of what or who bore the seeds of the group's eventual split, there's one factor most people agree on: that the young musicians needed time off in the wake of NSA's phenomenal success. Burnout is a factor, and we'll get to that in this episode. But pretending that the start of the breakup doesn't matter feels really performative after 4 paragraphs of implying that the real impetus for the split was Lance wanting to do side projects. Then the article closes by focusing on whether the public would be receptive of a version of NSYNC that didn't include Justin, citing the group's 4-member Coachella performance as something that reignited reunion talk. I understand the Coachella link, but I think that's a strange thing to speculate about given the premise of the article. If Lance's side projects were supposedly leading factors in the breakup, then wouldn't the logical question be whether the public would accept NSYNC without Lance? But she doesn't ask that at all. Even after pretending to explore other factors, she still manages to center Justin's lack of participation. So by the time you work through the whole article, Leena's pattern is pretty clear. The article doesn't just question Lance, it stacks other perspectives against his with no support, and then frames his explanation like a defense instead of a first-hand experience. It's unbalanced, and it undermines commentary from the one person in the article who was actually part of NSYNC. And speaking of things that are unbalanced, we need to talk about Barry Weiss, because the article gives unquestioned authority to the former Jive Records president while completely ignoring the power he wielded over the group's fate. We'll look at his version of events next. If Leena Tailor shows how a narrative can be shaped by structure and tone, then Barry Weiss shows how it can be shaped by authority and deflection. The way his comments are presented tells you a lot about how perception drifts when history is removed from the equation. Barry claims that Justin only truly started considering a solo career when Lance Bass and Joey Fatone took roles in the film On the Line. That already puts a kink in the timeline. If Justin truly started considering it then it implicitly means that he was already considering it before that point. And if Barry is telling this to a journalist, it means that the label was likely well aware of this. The article tries to have it both ways, acknowledging Justin's solo ambitions while still framing Lance's movie as the catalyst for the break that turned into a breakup. That's not how causality works. If Justin was already thinking about going solo, On the Line didn't create the idea. It just gave Barry a convenient place to pin the blame. Barry Weiss says, and I'm quoting here, that On the Line was a strategic error on the band's part and ultimately what broke the group up. And that if the movie hadn't happened, there would have been at least 1, if not 2, more NSYNC albums. I want to reflect on that for a second, because how does that make sense? Justin couldn't have launched a solo career without Barry's approval. He was under contract. Every cost footed by Jive Records would have needed Barry's approval for Justin's solo rollout. So for him to imply that Lance's movie is the reason the group didn't continue only works if you choose to forget who Barry Weiss was. And that's hard to do since Leena put it right up front and introduced him by saying he used to be the president of Jive Records. He wasn't watching this unfold from a distance. He was running the label. He had the power. Lance didn't. And before I wrap up this point, I have to ask, if On the Line was really a strategic error, then did anyone say anything to Lance at the time? Leena twists things in a way that implies that Lance was confronted about supposedly not operating in the best interests of the band. But like I explained, that conversation happened 3 years after he filmed the movie. Why didn't anyone from the label step in if things were that bad? Why didn't the group's management warn him that he was jeopardizing the next album? The same album that was already behind schedule by the time On the Line started filming, in case anyone forgot. You can hear more about that in Lance's episode this season. Something's not adding up. If this movie was really the thing that broke the group up, then the people with actual power, the label executives, the management, they would have intervened. They would have said something and probably tried to stop it. But despite all of this chatter after the fact, It seems like nobody did. And I think that prolonged silence says a lot. I think it tells us that the movie wasn't seen as a threat at the time. It also tells us that the people in charge likely didn't view the movie as a problem. And specifically for Barry, it tells us that his opinion only appears years later, when it's convenient, and when the audience is far enough removed from the timeline that the contradictions aren't obvious. Here's the part of Barry's comments that really don't hold up. The chain of causality he presents goes something like this. Joey and Lance take roles in a movie in 2001. Justin suddenly has space to truly consider going solo and decides that's what he wants to do. Okay, and then here's the part not mentioned in the article. Somehow, Justin's entire solo rollout magically gets approved. Studio time, production budgets, marketing, radio promotion, all of it just gets greenlit by unnamed forces. Maybe it was fairies, maybe sprites, maybe a wizard was involved, but apparently not the president of Jive Records. And after years of being solo, Justin isn't interested in returning to the group, or at least that's what Lance remembers being told. But Barry doesn't talk about that part. He only says that Justin had the space to think and decide he wanted to go solo, and then somehow Lance's movie is the strategic error that broke the group up. If On the Line had caused some massive internal rift, I'm not sure NSYNC would have been able to finish the Celebrity album or do the Pop Odyssey tour. But there's still the years left after 2001, and there's still the bigger issue. Once Justin privately told the group that he wasn't coming back, any version of NSYNC that tried to move forward without him would have needed to renegotiate their contract with Jive. And Barry is the person who ultimately would have been able to approve that. I'm not claiming to know the specifics of their contract, and I'm not pretending to have insider information. But what I can say is this: it doesn't make sense to claim that Lance's movie prevented one or two more NSYNC albums when the only person who could have contractually facilitated those albums, with or without Justin, was Barry Weiss. He was the one with the authority to approve the 4-member path forward. He was the one who could have facilitated those hypothetical albums. One last thing I want to address when it comes to Barry Weiss is his comments on the role Burnout played in the group wanting a break. He was quoted as saying the group was burnt out, touring a lot, and tired. Okay, but why? Maybe because they had just finished the No Strings Attached tour in December 2000, and within weeks of that, they were already telling the press that they'd be in the studio in January working on a follow-up album. I wonder who approved that idea. So that's where Barry's contributions to the ET Canada article leaves us. It leaves us with a story that only works if you ignore the timeline, ignore power dynamics, and don't think about basic business logistics. But Barry Weiss isn't the only person Leena Tailor interviewed. To fill space with authoritative-sounding voices, she turned to two people closer to the creative process, Alex Greggs and Joe Riccitelli. If Barry Weiss represented the bird's eye view from the executive suite, then Alex Greggs and Joe Riccitelli represented something a little different. Commentary from people who were close enough to the machine to see pieces of it, but not close enough to see the whole thing. Let's start with Alex, since he has more real estate in this article. He's presented as a creative collaborator, someone who lived with J.C. Chasez at one point, and generally positioned as an insider with direct knowledge of what was happening with NSYNC. Despite the article supposedly being about whether Lance's side projects broke up the group, the first quote attributed to Alex is about Justin. People think Justin was like, "That's it, I'm done. I'm the one everyone's looking at, so I'm going to go off on my own." But it was quite the opposite, because not once had JC or Justin ever asked me about doing other songs. This was a direct quote from Alex Greggs. He then also said, "There was never any hint of solo music until Lance came into the room and said, 'I'm going into space, so we'll need a year off.'" There are three missing elements to what Alex said: when he found out, how he found out, and who this information supposedly came from. But even without that, his input is positioned as reliable, despite the fact that later in the same article, Lance Bass says the break was only intended to be 6 months. Since we don't have more context for Alex's comments, we can't compare them directly to the hiatus conversation Lance remembered in his memoir. We also can't assume Alex's recollections preceded the conversation that Lance remembers from late 2001. His comment about there being no hint of solo music until after Lance mentioned space also lacks context, though that's probably based on his limited access to other conversations. As far as he knew, there were no mentions of solo music. Other people who were privy to different conversations, like Angie Stone, for example, would have shared different recollections. Really, so much of what Alex says in this article relies on the assumption that his vantage point was universal, that because he didn't hear the word solo, nobody was using it at the time. But that's not how information works. Whatever he heard, whenever he heard it, and whomever he heard it from is exactly that. It's what he was told. Alex isn't omniscient. He's not a historian and he's not a member of NSYNC. But the article treats his limited access as if it's a definitive account of what was happening behind the scenes. And then there's the part where he supposedly says the group was thinking about leaving while we were on top because boy bands were waning. I'm not getting into that today. That belongs in a completely different conversation, and I'll come back to it when I get into the NSYNC versus Backstreet Boys hiatus comparison. But for now, I'll just say that it doesn't line up with any of the comments I've seen from the members of NSYNC when they've actually talked about how things ended in the 2000s. Before I wrap things up with Alex, I'll touch briefly on his comments about the reunion being what he called a logistical nightmare. This is another place where the article used his perspective as if it were definitive, even though he was speaking from the outside looking in. He essentially framed the potential NSYNC reunion as a no-win situation. He said that if the reunion flopped without Justin, it would just reinforce the idea that some people have that he was carrying the group. If a reunion without Justin was successful, it would put everyone in the position of uprooting their lives, and that's something he says that some of the guys didn't want. Once again, with no additional context, it's not completely clear if these are things that were said directly to Alex, or if it's more of his speculation from second and third-hand sources. Joe Riccitelli contributes the least to this article. His comments aren't substantial enough to compare them to what we've covered this season, but in the interest of fairness, I'll address them anyway. Joe is the former senior vice president of promotions for Jive Records, and as of the publication date of this article, he still worked with Justin at RCA Records. He said he never witnessed any animosity among the group and believes that the long-term split was the result of the group outgrowing each other, describing it, and I quote, as a natural life story of a teenager becoming a man, and saying, I want to experience new things in life. In 2001, the only member of NSYNC who was still a teenager was Justin, and that was only for the first 30 days of the year. We don't know what questions Leena asked Joe directly, but considering the point of this article was supposed to be addressing lesser-known factors in NSYNC's breakup, specifically the things traced back to Lance Bass, I think it's interesting that Joe's description of the breakup comes down to a singular teenager growing into a singular man. When it comes to Joe's comments, I think what he didn't say is more important than what he did. Barry talked about having a bird's eye view while pretending he wasn't ruling the roost, even though he was the one at the top of the perch signing off on everything. Joe, on the other hand, didn't minimize his position as an executive. He minimized the business itself. He gave a very self-development-oriented, subjective explanation about a teenager becoming a man and about people outgrowing each other, which is convenient because you can't refute how somebody feels. But it also bypasses the actual structure of the group. NSYNC wasn't a hobby club started by a bunch of friends. These guys weren't frat brothers who moved in together and decided to maybe run a weekend car washing business. NSYNC was a multi-million-dollar global brand. Saying they outgrew each other doesn't address or amend the agreements and contracts that were already in place. Outgrowing something doesn't dissolve obligations, and it doesn't magically release anyone from the business structure they were operating inside. So when Joe frames the breakup as a teenager becoming a man, He's focusing on the psychosocial aspect while completely ignoring the business aspect. And that's ironic because he wasn't the senior vice president of developmental maturity or the senior vice president of friendship management. He was the senior vice president of promotions, and promotions only exist when there's an active, lucrative business to promote. Together, Alex Greggs and Joe Riccitelli represent two kinds of partial perspectives, one limited by access and the other limited by usefulness. But together, the article elevates these two perspectives as if they explain the breakup. They really don't. They fill space in a narrative that needed people who sounded authoritative, even if these voices weren't offering anything substantial. And now we get to Lance Bass, the only member of NSYNC who was quoted in the ET Canada article. Leena Tailor pulled lines from Lance's memoir and even noted that it was published in 2007, but like I mentioned earlier, she used the quotes she pulled in a way that stripped them of their original context. She presented them as if she was describing something that happened in 2001, when in reality, those quotes were concerning a moment that happened 3 years later. It was a 2004 meeting when the group was supposed to begin preparing for their next album, but according to Lance's recollection, Justin announced he wasn't coming back. It wasn't a 2001 conversation, and it wasn't part of the celebrity era. But the article never tells the reader that. Instead, those quotes were cherry-picked and dropped into a completely different part of the timeline, creating the impression that the comments about not operating in the best interests of the band were part of the On the Line era. Whether it was intentional or not, it was misleading. What makes that cherry-picking even more strange is that Leena never acknowledged that Lance's new quotes in the article line up with what he already said in 2007. His recollection had actually been pretty consistent for over a decade by the time this article was published. But by ignoring that continuity, the article stripped him of credibility. It made his version of things look like just one opinion among many, instead of it being the only first-hand narrative from somebody who had already publicly explained what he remembers from that time. Then there's this omission. Lance's timeline directly contradicts what Alex Greggs said earlier in the article. Alex claimed that he was told Lance wanted to take a year off to go into space, but Lance's account of things is more precise. He says that Justin proposed a 6-month break so he could try a solo album, and he only agreed to pursue the space mission if he could be back by November 1st. For context, the celebrity tour ended April 28th in 2002. And counting forward from May 1st takes you exactly 6 months to the date that Lance gave. Nothing in the record so far, nothing in 2001, suggests that Lance was planning a space mission during the group's active period. Lance's version aligns with the dates, the math, and the sequence of events he's described consistently since 2007. Alex's 1-year claim doesn't line up with anything. But I feel like I need to backtrack a little bit right here, because the way Lance was introduced in this article is telling. Before he ever got to speak about the timeline, the reader was walked through two people who contradicted him. Alex with his 1-year break claim, and then Barry with his claim that On the Line created the opening for Justin to consider and decide to go solo. Only after those two people are explored in the article does Leena turn and ask, so what does Bass have to say about this? And instead of starting with his recollection of the 6-month break, she leads with his most personal vulnerability, the part where he talks about throwing himself into work to stay closeted and stay distracted. In the layout of the article, that emotional disclosure takes up almost the same visual space as his actual timeline. And because of where it's placed, it reads almost like a soft admission of guilt. His sincerity was positioned like a confession. And by the time he finally gets to the part where he explains about the proposed 6-month break and how he knew he had to be back by November 1st, the reader has already been primed to see Lance as overwhelmed, distracted, and indirectly responsible for how things turned out, even though his timeline is the only one that can be mapped to a real calendar. But that's not to say that Lance's perspective is infallible, because it's not. His point of view is limited, just in a very different way from the other men quoted in this article. Lance's limitations come from being inside the bubble, where he only had access to the conversations he personally participated in and the information that he was directly told. And that matters because the other perspectives in this article aren't grounded in direct communication at all, or at least that's not how they're presented. Alex never said Lance told him anything directly about wanting a year off. Nothing about his quotes implied direct contact, and Leena Tailor didn't frame it that way. Barry Weiss doesn't say that Justin told him that On the Line was the moment he started thinking about going solo. Barry simply speaks as if he had insight into Justin's internal process. Joe Riccitelli's comments don't imply that anyone in the group ever told him that they had outgrown each other. This is just something he somehow magically seems to know on his own. Lance is the only person in this article who's describing something he remembers as direct communication. What Justin said to him, what the group agreed to, and what the timeline was supposed to be. But even then, that direct communication didn't make him privy to the conversations happening outside of the NSYNC bubble, like the private discussions with potential collaborators or any early solo planning. And even in situations where Lance was physically present, like the Billboard Music Awards soundcheck, he still wasn't privy to specific conversations. The Angie Stone moment is a perfect example. Lance was almost certainly in the same room because the group was required to be there for work. But he wasn't part of the soundcheck conversation when Justin told Angie, "Your CD's in my car right now. You have to work on my solo project." That information never reached Lance. And as I mentioned back in episode 6, the timeline we have so far suggests that this conversation with Angie happened roughly 2 weeks before Justin reportedly approached the group asking about taking a 6-month break the following year. Lance wasn't part of that early December conversation because he wasn't supposed to be. His perspective is incomplete because certain decisions were happening elsewhere. And that's not a flaw in his recollection. It's simply the context of how things operated around him. And this is why Lance becomes the turning point for this episode. His account of things isn't perfect and it's not complete. No one's is. But it's the only one rooted in direct communication and lived experience. And for the purposes of this episode, his perspective marks a moment where we'll stop relying on the framing in the ET Canada article and start returning to the actual timeline of 2001 as it unfolded through the eyes of 5 young men who were navigating burnout, ambition, pressure, and the corporate machinery around them. Let's move backwards into that final active era and see what the history has to say. Now we can finally step back and look at the bigger picture. Not just Lance's story, but everything we've covered so far in Unsynchronized. When you put all 6 of this season's episodes together, certain themes start to stand out, and it becomes clear how they showed up over time, through different media pieces, and across individual paths. I think the first theme that reveals itself is burnout. NSYNC's peak years were built on a schedule that was pretty much unsustainable, and the cracks were showing before anybody publicly said the word hiatus. When the group had a 2-month break between the legs of the No Strings Attached tour, People magazine asked them what they wanted to do with their downtime. Their answers were very telling. Joey said he wanted to go away. Chris wanted to play video games. And Justin said that he wanted to go to his own home. These are ordinary things that sound extraordinary when you've been grinding nonstop for 8 months and still have a year-end push ahead of you. The second leg of the NSA tour ended in December of 2000, and before the month was over, they were already telling MTV that they'd be back in the studio in January to start the next album. Fast forward to their Larry King interview on January 9th in 2001. Lance confirmed that the next 2 months would be spent recording the new album. He also mentioned that when friends or family came and visited them, these people would spend a few days with the group and feel like they needed a week off just from watching them work. That's not a casual comment. That's a quiet acknowledgement of how extreme the pace really was. And despite the plan to finish the album by the end of February, the work dragged on. It wasn't done in February, or March, or possibly even April. Based on reporting in the Rolling Stone feature that came out in August of 2001, Recording for the Celebrity album may not have been fully wrapped until early May. The release date for Celebrity was pushed back from June to July, and the new tour was pushed back too, but not by much. In late April, rehearsals for the Pop Odyssey tour had already started, and by mid-May, rehearsals were paused so the group could film the music video for the new album's lead single. Even with the delays, the public messaging still stayed upbeat. Entertainment Weekly ran a piece in which the members were asked whether it felt too soon to be releasing another album. The group talked about staying visible, keeping the hype going, how much they loved being on the road, and also talked about feeling like a new album would help to push the new tour. But when you place those PR-friendly responses next to the reality of the delays and the sheer amount of work that must have been happening behind the scenes, a big disconnect becomes clear. The public narrative emphasized excitement. The internal reality looked like a recipe for exhaustion. The Pop Odyssey tour kicked off on May 23rd and ran until September 1st. NSYNC was on a break in the fall. Imagine the air quotes around the phrase on a break. In November, Joey told the BBC that he hoped the break they were taking at the time would last a little longer. But to me, that break didn't look like much of a break at all. They were still making public appearances as a group and still doing live performances throughout the rest of the year. Even though not every member openly spoke about fatigue, the pattern is clear. When some members are acknowledging exhaustion publicly, and when the workload is this intense, it's reasonable to conclude that all of them were feeling it in some capacity. So what we see is that burnout wasn't a sudden development. It was already starting to show a bit in the year 2000, and then starting to be quietly acknowledged in 2001. But the burnout didn't happen in isolation. It happened inside a group whose internal relationships affected how information moved, and sometimes how it didn't move between its members. That's why the second theme that emerges from season 1 is an intersection of 3 C's: cohesion, connection, and communication. These things together give us a sense of how the members of NSYNC saw themselves as a group, who seemed closest to whom within the group, and how information flowed between those relationships. Throughout the year, different members spoke about the group in ways that reflected their own internal relationship to it. Joey using collective we language to express hope for their future and also hope for more time off. Lance framing the group as sharing a common need for a break. And in the Arena On Plus article, Justin emphasizing separateness and individuation. None of these perspectives by themselves prove anything about how information moved inside the group, but together they show us that the members didn't all conceptualize NSYNC in the same way. I think there was one moment when the social layout of NSYNC became visible, even though it was wrapped in a joke. In the same Entertainment Weekly interview that I just mentioned, Justin insisted that the group genuinely liked each other and they were truly friends. At that point, Chris jumped in with a tangent about cliques within NSYNC. JC wasn't in Chris's clique, but Joey was. When Chris said Lance had a clique that he wasn't allowed into, Lance replied by saying it was a force field. These are jokes, clearly, but jokes like that only work when there's a thread of truth running through. Chris's joking about cliques gives us a light sense of how the members naturally clustered. And that context becomes relevant when we look at the one moment that we can document clearly, which is the hiatus conversation that Lance remembered in his memoir. According to what he remembers, this discussion didn't happen with all 5 members together in the same room. It happened in pieces. Lance and Joey were already together. Justin entered the room to speak to them. He leaves, and then a bit later, JC comes in, seeming visibly upset, and there was no mention of when or how Chris was informed of this proposed hiatus. We can't say this is typical because we don't have enough examples. But when you consider this moment alongside the different ways that members conceptualized the group throughout the year, it becomes clear that cohesion, connection, and communication weren't always experienced the same by everyone within NSYNC. And that can help to explain why the conversation Lance remembers unfolded the way that it did. To get a better understanding of why communication may have been so uneven, we need to look at the structural power dynamics underneath it. The professional roles or the lanes that each member of NSYNC occupied, and also the very different amounts of leverage that those lanes granted them. That's why lanes and leverage will be the next theme that we see emerging from this first season of Unsynchronized. Every member had a functional role inside of NSYNC, not just in terms of vocal parts, but in terms of the work that kept the machine running. JC and Justin carried most of the musical labor, while Lance, Joey, and Chris contributed to visual concepts, logistics, and overall group cohesion. But those roles weren't valued equally by the industry, and that disparity shaped who had the power to influence the group's future. Justin was the only member whose internal lane translated into substantial leverage in 2001. JC had respect and authority in the studio, but not the kind of leverage that determines outcomes. Just as an example, 2 of his songs were positioned as potential singles, yet neither ever became radio releases. And in some of the early promotional materials for the Celebrity album, he wasn't even credited for his own work. Meanwhile, the members whose internal lanes didn't come with structural power had side projects that had the potential for leverage and for structural power outside of NSYNC. Chris kept expanding market share with Fu Manskito, and he managed a parallel promotional tour alongside the Pop Odyssey tour. Lance had already built a talent management company. By 2001, he was managing a country artist. He had a film production company and produced On the Line. And within weeks of the movie's release, his company had already started acquiring more scripts. Joey's acting roles didn't give him leverage on their own, but they made him visible in ways that being the baritone in a boy band didn't. And that's not to say that these side projects were pursued because they gave people leverage outside of NSYNC. But it's just a reflection of how that group bubble didn't necessarily create space for all of the potential or all of the talents that all of the members had. That's what the evidence shows us in 2001. All of the members of NSYNC had different lanes and different amounts of leverage. The consequences of those differences won't become fully visible until the members start moving apart more in 2002. And we'll get into that in season 2. From lanes and leverage, we move to external signals, which is basically my way of summarizing how the industry outside of NSYNC responded to all of the lanes and leverage that the different members had. In 2001, the external signals about the members of NSYNC were not evenly distributed. Only one member had outside collaborators giving public, front-facing messaging that tried to position him as someone beyond the group. Pharrell Williams and Wayne Brady made comments to the media about Justin as an individual entertainer, and they did it in a way that minimized the work that he was still doing with NSYNC at the time. While most of the group was the object of positive validation for their side projects, no one else received the kind of validation that minimized their work at the time as part of NSYNC. None of Joey's acting colleagues were forecasting a breakout career and implying his days as a singer were numbered. None of the buyers or fashion analysts discussing Fu Manskito were positioning Chris as someone poised to pivot away from the group and expand an empire. I think that as far as 2001 goes, the silence is part of the evidence. Most of the group was not being publicly imagined as having a future outside of NSYNC. And it wasn't because the others lacked talent or ambition. It's because the industry wasn't looking at them as individuals at all. Another thing to consider when it comes to these external signals is the timing. When Wayne Brady made his comment to TV Guide about Justin being the one to watch after NSYNC is over, he said this within 2 weeks of the release of the Celebrity album. This was a moment when the group should have been presenting a unified front and not being put in the position of dealing with comments from people who implied that the unity would be ending soon. Pharrell Williams' comment about Justin showing people what he's capable of when it's time for him to do his solo was something that came while the group was still working on the Celebrity album. Whether that was early May, which is what was implied by the Rolling Stone article, or possibly late March, since I did come across that article stating that NSYNC was in the studio with the Neptunes at that point. These were both future-facing comments from these two men. The kinds of comments that people make when they already know or strongly suspect that someone is being positioned for something else. The Angie Stone comment that I referenced earlier is also an external signal, but this one is different. She wasn't hinting at or predicting anything. She was talking about a request from Justin that was attached to what sounds like a decision that had already been made by that point. And that matters because it shows that moves were being made outside of the group that would affect the group before those moves were being brought to the group's attention. None of the other members had external partners making comments that implied their time with NSYNC was limited or would become limited soon. The importance of the external signals around NSYNC at the time come down to a combination of the content of the messaging, the positioning of the messaging, and also the timing. When you look back at the early signals, they read like the building blocks of the public logic around the hiatus, the version of events that made sense to the outside world. But in all likelihood, that logic wasn't what the group itself was operating on. Most members of NSYNC weren't seeing these comments. They weren't interpreting the moment through the lens of who the industry was positioning for what. Internally, NSYNC was working off of a completely different understanding of what their break would mean, even as the external narrative was already drifting or being pushed in another direction. So for the purposes of Unsynchronized, this is where we draw the line between the external logic of the hiatus and the internal logic of the hiatus. The external signals from 2001, the comments, the positioning, the timing, became the foundation of the public story about why the so-called hiatus happened and what it meant. But those signals weren't necessarily informing the group's own understanding of their break. The hiatus logic we're working with here isn't a theme that emerged across the season. It's a framework that we're constructing in this final episode, based on the themes we've discussed, to make sense of how the public narrative and the internal experience diverged. The logic of the hiatus isn't about one member's intentions. It's about how the underlying dynamics of 2001 created a situation where the group's break was not understood or experienced the same way by everyone. All 5 members were burnt out, which meant that the idea of taking time off made sense on its face. But the group's internal communication patterns, their different lanes, the uneven leverage that each member held, all of those things meant that the same proposal landed differently depending on who heard it and when. The only first-hand attempt to reconstruct the timeline comes from Lance, and his account shows a process that was fragmented and shifting. A conversation that began as a proposal for 6 months off to fool around with a solo project escalated into an open-ended break with no clear terms. At the same time, external signals were pointing in directions that it seems the group hadn't fully discussed internally. Collaborators like Pharrell and Wayne made future-facing comments while Celebrity was still being recorded or newly released, and Angie Stone later described being approached for a feature before the group had a unified conversation about taking a break. These receipts don't tell us what each member felt, but they do show us that the information available to the public, and even to people outside of the group, was sometimes clearer than the information that was circulating inside of it. This disparity is one of the many factors that come together to form the so-called hiatus. It wasn't a single shared decision so much as it was the convergence of burnout, uneven communication, uneven leverage, uneven external signals, and the creation of a moment where different members walked away with different understandings of what the future would hold for them. Echoes versus Evidence was our first deep dive into the ET Canada article that originally sparked this entire project. We identified the voices behind the piece, including the writer herself, and examined their claims through the lens of the themes that have emerged throughout Season 1. Those themes included the group's burnout in 2001, the uneven communication patterns within the group, the different lanes and levels of leverage that each member had, and the external signals coming from collaborators and industry figures. Alex Gregg spoke from the limited vantage point of a producer and a collaborator, but his comments were positioned as if they reflected the full picture. In the ET Canada article, he says that he only heard about potential solo work after hearing that Lance wanted to go to space and take a year off, but he never says Lance told him this directly. His information came through second or possibly third-hand channels, but the article tried to make it sound authoritative. Barry Weiss offered what he called a bird's-eye view, but he did so while distancing himself from the power that he actually held at the time. He framed Justin's solo decision as something that emerged naturally during the downtime created by Lance's movie, while glossing over the fact that none of the resources Justin needed from Jive Records could have been approved without his direct consent as the president of the company. Joe Riccitelli contributed little more than vague platitudes about people growing up and outgrowing each other. His comments focused entirely on personal development and social positioning, while ignoring the contractual, logistical, and organizational realities of a multi-million-dollar global business with 5 equal partners. And the writer, Leena Tailor, used deliberate rhetorical choices that elevated these outside corporate voices while minimizing Lance Bass's perspective, even though he's the only member of NSYNC featured in the article and the only person whose comments actually aligned with the documented history of 2001. Lance's comments in the ET Canada article that deal with 2001, like his mention of the burnout the group was experiencing and his expectation for a short break, those things line up with the receipts that we've traced throughout this first season of Unsynchronized. While future seasons of the podcast will give us more points for comparison when it comes to the article, I think it's already becoming clear that the version of events presented in the article by Leena Tailor don't hold up against the historical record. So far, history simply isn't on the side of most of the men who participated in this piece or on the side of the woman who wrote it. So after all of this, what are today's major takeaways? I think the first takeaway is that the public narrative that's put forward in this article is a reconstruction, and it's polished, but it's not the historical reality. The explanations that get repeated in interviews and entertainment coverage are simplified, tidy, and likely curated for strategic reasons. They only brush up against what actually happened over the course of NSYNC's breakup. The real story, the one that's preserved in the historical receipts, is more complicated and less coordinated than what the sanitized versions suggest. The second takeaway? It's that the breakup didn't begin with a single decision or a single action. It emerged from a year of uneven dynamics that never lined up cleanly inside the group. Burnout, uneven communication, uneven leverage, uneven external signals, and uneven access to information likely all shaped how each member of NSYNC understood the same moment. And when you look at it that way, the so-called hiatus wasn't a unified choice so much as it was the point where all of those underlying dynamics finally converged. And the result was different people walking away with different interpretations of what their futures would look like. And the third takeaway for this episode is actually foundational to the rest of the podcast series. From this point forward, Unsynchronized will be operating with 2 parallel frameworks for understanding the so-called hiatus. There'll be the public logic and then the internal logic. And the work of this podcast is to try to be mindful of both and hold on to both at the same time. What that means going forward is that we'll be working with 2 separate logics. Like I said, there's the public logic, and that will be shaped by external signals, industry commentary, external pressures and actions, and essentially the logic that was front-facing and the way that the so-called hiatus was framed for the public. Then there's the internal logic, and that comes through the perspectives and the experiences of the 5 members of NSYNC who lived through the so-called hiatus. The rest of this series will be in part about understanding how those 2 logics developed, where they diverged, and what that divergence shows about NSYNC's breakup as it unfolded. So that's where we'll close season 1 of Unsynchronized. We've spent the past 6 episodes inside of the details of 5 separate lives, 5 separate pressures, and 1 year that didn't unfold the same way for any 2 members of the group. At the beginning of season 2, we're going to widen the frame again, and that means going to a wider view of 2001. Looking at NSYNC as a collective, and also looking at the media and the industry narratives that were forming around them. Looking at what the world was saying about NSYNC, and what the world believed about their future. That creates a lot of context for what the group stepped into in 2002, so that's where we'll begin with the next season. Until then, this has been Nicole Raposo. Season 2 of Unsynchronized kicks off on September 24th, and I hope to see you there. Remember, until next time, you can't spell unsynchronized without NSYNC.